is that we come from our predecessors who saw the world as alive, right? And saw legend intertwining with reality, animism, like things were animated. But eventually modernity came about, and that was all lost. And he says, that's well and good, but our sense of life has been extinguished. Because symbol and the sense of the sacred, all of those things are dead to us. And he says, so we have to return to a second naivete. And that is, we've come through modernity with its criticalness and its sense of what constitutes history and science explaining things. But we need to come back to a place where symbol and the sacred are real, where they mean something to us. And his point isn't that we come back to naivete. I shouldn't draw this here. The point isn't that we come back to naivete, but that we walk somewhere past modernity to somewhere where symbol and the sense of what is sacred is alive. Because he says that is, for us as humans, we search out a meaning that is larger than and more than what is before us. What is transcendental, what is sacred. And so that kind of, he uses this word of saturation. The ability of something to speak and continue to speak and to give meaning and continue to give meaning is only happening after we kind of walk through modernity. And so in that sense, I think that's by and large a lot what Vodoloskin is doing. I don't think Vodoloskin would explain it in this way at all. This is me kind of riffing here. But I think this is important, right? What is this book saying to us as contemporary readers in this 21st century? And how is it making the world more alive, more saturated with meaning? And how is it making our faith larger than it is? And moving from a more literal faith, and I'm not using literal as in we read the Bible literally, but just reading the Bible is like, or treating our faith as like, well, it's just this tradition that's passed on. Instead, how do we see it as something that gives us a direct contact with God and is something that is unfathomable in its depths? We can never fully understand it, that its mystery is exceeding and saturated. Does that make sense? Think about that as we read this, especially with this first section. We're going to get into the kind of Lenten themes more as the book progresses, but I really want to pay attention to what is re-enchantment in this first discussion period. So how'd everyone feel about the book?
Good.
Good? Yeah?
Earthy.
Slow beginning, but I'm into it now.
Okay. Anyone else? Well, when we read Diary of a Country Priest, I think you all wanted to kill me until the very end. So that's good. I feel we're in a better place. Before we get into kind of walking through the book, what were your first thoughts upon reading it? What kind of came to mind as you read it? Did it compare to other books you've read, or did it seem strange? Or I remember one of the first things that I thought when I was reading it was, wow, this is really good. But it also kind of felt like it was like almost a fable in a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it kind of had this fableish, sense to it. Does anyone want to chip in?
Choppy to start with.
Choppy.
And I wondered if the translation had something to do with it.
It's very much meant to be that kind of way. I think the story fills out a lot more, especially in the middle. The middle section is like the time spent in his life is spent. There's much more context and content. It's what's that?
I like the way it's arsoning, right? It's like a child. It's his thoughts, like he's absorbing things, doesn't always understand it.
Yeah.
I love the relationship with the wolf. I just thought that was I don't know why, I just love the touching. And it was his, now you tamed it, now it's your responsibility to care.
Right.
I don't know.
What other thoughts did y'all have? Just general thoughts.
Well, I loved everything about it. I was still blown out of the water that he delineated 4 different selves right in the very beginning. I don't know about the rest of you, some of us by our age, I start thinking, how about me? How would I have broken myself into certain categories? And of course, the love between the grandfather
Mm-hmm.
and the love the grandfather had for the planet and the world.
Mm.
And sort of this, a term that you could also use as magical realism
Mm.
of, weaving in and out. And of course, then the wolf saves his life and then he died. Goes off to die.
Yeah, that's a
I mean,
tough part.
I'm just saying, this love I'm feeling with two major pieces already gone. I'm like, oh man, this is gonna be bad, because we left that, we know what's happening after that in page 74, right? So I'm like, oh dear, let's just take this easy. But I'll stop.
Okay.
It's like reading Dostoevsky, the Russian literature, and thank you for the names that you listed, and
Yeah.
because, like Dostoevsky, you get 3 or 4 names for the same person.
Yeah.
And so it's an amazing way that the great Russian authors write, and it just pulls you right into the story. It's
Yeah.
very, very interesting.
Anyone else?
It reminded me of episodic, like Gulliver's Travel, Don Quixote, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100
Mhm.
years. I mean, it's that magical realism,
Mhm.
and that's kind of exciting. And I like the idea that your primary years really do affect you, but you grow.
Mm.
And I think that chapters in our lives applies to us.
Mhm.
The lecture last week really helped. If I hadn't had that, I might have been a little lost at first, but I went into it knowing, like you said, the background of, where he's coming from, and that was helpful.
Good. So I want to walk through, and I'm just going to point out a couple of things. If you have something to add, or there's a specific section you want to talk about, just stop me. We're going to spend the rest of the class just having a book discussion, more or less. I'm going to kind of guide it and add in stuff, but please feel free to add in what you have in mind and what comes to mind. And I want to start on page 10. I've ordered books. They are not in yet. I ordered all the books that were on Amazon, and so I had to order from someone else, and I wasn't able to do the Prime shipping. And so they'll be in this week, hopefully. So if you do not have a book and still want one, I will have one. Just come up to me after class and let me know, and I will email you as soon as they come in. Otherwise, look at people that have books now and ask them to be kind and share. So on page 10, there's this, the second paragraph. It says, "It was said that even then he pictured," this is speaking of Christopher, "the further fate of that place quite distinctly, that even at that remote time he allegedly knew that in 1495 a cemetery church would be constructed on the site of his log house. The church was built in gratitude for the favorable conclusion of the year 1492, the 7,000th year since the creation of the world. The anticipated end of the world did not come to pass that year, but Christopher's namesake did discover America, though nobody paid any attention to this at the time, unexpectedly for himself and others." Christopher's predicting, right? This is in 1440-ish. He's already seeing past when he will be dead, past Arseny moving out, what's happening to where his house is, that there will be something built there. So already Vodoloskin is playing with our sense of time. And I want to say something because two of you mentioned magical realism, and that's most famous with 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But this is not magical realism. Vodoloskin is trying to say this is real. This is how people saw the world in that day and age. And this is real now. We just don't see it in a way. So keep that in mind, because it does seem like magical realism. It does seem so far from us. And yet, Vodoloskin is trying to show us something. He's trying to re-enchant us in a way that is, I want to say, transcends the boundaries of what constitutes truth and what constitutes fiction. For us today, we think of truth and fiction in the terms of it's either real and it happened, it's something verifiable, it's something empirical, it's something I can see with my senses. But Vodoloskin is trying to say faith extends beyond these boundaries, these kind of childish boundaries, I would say, of what's true and false. For instance, we all have stories we tell ourselves, right? And there's a meaning to them that extends beyond just the actual verifiable facts of what happened, right? And so that's happening throughout this book. There's something stronger than just, did this happen or did it not happen? And that's kind of like what I was getting at with symbolism, right? Symbolism exceeds truth and fiction, these kind of categories that we impose. And so here, from the beginning, time is being messed with. Arseni's grandfather, Christopher, is seeing beyond the bounds of his own life, but also into 1609 and 1991, 1817, right? And so linear time's being played with. What'd y'all think about that?
Okay, I loved it. I love anything that can play with my mind in a healthy way.
Mhm.
Just adding that part. It's fun. It's fun. It shakes me up. And you know, when you tie into faith, it's pretty magical itself.
Yeah.
I don't always use that word, but people coming back to life is pretty magical.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the time thing, and a lot of people project in the future. A lot of spiritual leaders have been able to say, this is what's happening and not. And it's very cool.
Yeah, it's not uncommon in the Orthodox world to have people that have what you would consider superhuman powers. And it's the same if you go throughout different traditions. I mean, in India, that's very common, and in other places like that. Kathy?
Well, I guess when I read it, I thought it was charming, okay?
Yeah.
More than anything else. But I guess part of what's bothering me about maybe the whole enchantment magical part is I'm looking for, and this is going back to fact, I'm looking for a real life example where somebody did this accurately, okay? I mean, so the skepticism is there. Okay, I'm anxious to see where we're going with this because I don't see how we can move past fact into, you know, other than in the area of religion, which obviously, yes, requires faith, does go beyond fact, okay?
So that's a great point. I'm glad you're bringing that up. The book is not trying to live in a world of truth or false or a fact or fiction. It's a story, and you have to take it that way. And the kind of whole thing I'm getting at with re-enchantment, and this is extreme, we bang our heads up against this, is we exist in a world where things are either true or they're false.
Right.
All the time. And religion is kind of that one place where we allow ourselves to exist outside of those bounds.
Right.
When I speak of re-enchantment, I'm not trying to say that people are going to start walking on water and I'm going to start predicting the future. I'm saying that we live in a world that is much deeper than fact or fiction. And so if you're trying to put stuff in the boxes of this is either true or false, you're still existing in the category of kind of the real world. And in the world of story, it's larger than that. This isn't something that's easy to take on, and it's something I've been studying for years, and I still wrestle with. But just kind of think about that. What is it? So Ricoeur had this term what he called poetics, and he wasn't talking about poetry. He was talking about the function of a story to exceed the bounds of truth and false. So when you think about when you read the Gospels, we're not reading it simply as a historical story, right? There's something more there. It has elements of history. It has elements of what we would call truth. But there are also these things that we just can't explain, right? And so it's exceeding the true and false categories.
Right, and I agree with that. I agree that much of faith is stuff you can't explain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I have no problem with that. But the way he plays with it here, I mean, these are facts. Okay?
Yeah.
In other words, Christopher is able to predict with absolute accuracy what's going to happen in 500 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's where I begin to have, you know, I thought it was charming. Okay? And then we moved on to the next part of the story. Okay? But I guess I'm having trouble seeing where it actually applies.
Okay. Well, we'll see where it goes.
Well, yeah. Okay.
Anyone else on this playing around with time and this conception of time not as just some linearity, but that in some sense kind of is able to coexist? Yes.
I wonder if you've read Karen Armstrong's book on the Battle for God.
I haven't read that one.
Yeah, that's the one on fundamentalism, and I just finished reading it a couple days ago, and what you're saying sounds like her distinction between right brain and left brain people. And she calls left brain people logos. That's rational.
Yeah, rationality.
reason.
Yeah.
And right brain people are mythos,
Right.
or you're intuitive.
Uh-huh.
And so she raises the same question that today in the scientific world, the focus is on logos. Everything must be seen or processed through our senses. And that leads to fundamentalism in the Bible. But then she argues then that we need to be more open to the right side of our brain, to intuitive reality, and expanding what we consider to be truth.
Yeah.
Which to me sounds very similar to what you're saying.
Yeah. I think a great example of this, because this is really hard for us to conceive, but if I feel like I'm belaboring the point, it's important. And so that's why. Think about your favorite piece of art or your favorite novel, okay? Completely fictional, not real. And yet they speak to you in ways that have affected your life, that have changed who you are and how you interact in the world. And so the capacity of something that is literally fictional has a way to affect you in the real world. And that's kind of what I'm driving at. And so, while we might not believe that someone can tell the future, maybe it's making us shift our thinking about time. Or maybe it's at the very least you're asking questions, right? And a piece of fiction is affecting you in the real world. Now, I remember when I was in high school, I read Catcher of the Rye. And like every teenage boy in high school, I was obsessed with it. I read like 11 times in a year. I didn't turn into a serial killer. The point being I'm trying to make here is that for 2 or 3 years, my world was deeply affected by Catcher in the Rye. I saw everything through the lens of Holden Caulfield. And I can go on and speak of other books, this being one. These pieces of art, these seemingly falsities, deeply affect us. And so that's kind of what I'm driving at, right? Is how does the power of story, the power of symbol, the power of sacred have a way to expand our sense of reality and who we are? So one other thing to point with time is not only is Vodolazkin playing with our sense of linear time, he's also playing with this kind of cyclical sense of time. So really pay attention, especially to this opening 74 pages that we read, because it will essentially repeat itself again. And it's really interesting how it happens. So page 13. Would someone read that top paragraph?
Christopher did not exactly believe in herbs. More likely, he believed God's help would come through any herb for a specific matter, just as that help comes through people. Both are instruments. He did not ponder why each of the herbs he knew was associated with strictly defined qualities. He considered that question frivolous. Christopher understood who had established that association, and that was all he needed to know.
Thanks. So healing obviously is a big part of this. Christopher is a doctor in the sense of that time and uses herbs and different concoctions that he makes, and he's teaching Arseny this. But there's this play on, is the healing coming from the herbs and the concoctions, or is it coming from God? And that's something that Vodolazkin plays with Christopher, but really comes through as we read the book of Arseny's life. And how he approaches healing. And so I was interested what y'all thought of this element of healing, but also that paragraph specifically with more likely he believed God's help would come.
I thought he just always kind of seemed he was intuitive. It wasn't like he wasn't trained. He didn't go to, a medical school. And I just wondered, like, how did he just kind of floated through the earth, and he lived in the woods, and he was kind of hairy, and, but even when Arseny kind of took over, it was almost like there was such an amount of faith there, like, I think this works, and the more he worked with people, like, the more he laid hands. He got more comfortable with it, and I think it was just, he was like an apprentice to his grandfather, and he loved watching his grandfather and ride on birch bark, and I thought, he just is going through, it's like they'd walk through the woods and they'd see things, but I just felt like he just had a sense of faith and a sense of time, like he talked about, dust to, ash to ashes and dust to dust, and man goes to dust, and he knew that, and so when he talked, I missed the beginning when he talked about, this is going to happen here. I just thought it was him saying, this is life, I know that I'm going to pass on, and I'm going to become dust, and he just had this connection with the earth that enabled him to find all the beautiful things in the earth that will help people, and that was his mission, was to help people. So his faith was that bridge between those two things.
Yeah. Anyone else on the faith and the faith healing versus just healing? This is something that's really foreign to us, right? I mean, none of y'all, maybe one or two of y'all, are going to see some kind of root doctor, right? And there are plenty of people doing this in Appalachians. I've read about this.
I was going to say, don't laugh. It's in
Yeah.
North Carolina.
Oh,
It's all
yeah.
Sharon McCollum's.
It occurs here in Florida too.
Yeah. And there's plenty of quacks, but there are also people that are deeply revered in the community that have some power of healing. And there is that sense that their healing extends beyond just the simplicity of what they're creating. It's, yes, and then Chuck?
So foreign to.
Taoism.
Oh, yeah? You want to say more?
Taoism is describing what Taoism is all about, tapping into the natural that is there to help us and make us whole.
Mm-hmm.
They connect with the natural. I mean, they've done that for thousands of years. This describes the same thing.
I was just gonna say, this is like Eastern medicine in many ways.
Not only the herbs and all, but the touching and the manipulating and, isn't there Raku or something, the pressure points and all that kind of stuff?
The reishi, or
I don't know,
Reiki?
Reiki or something, Raku, Reiki or something, that whole thing of the.
Yeah, and what's interesting, y'all speak about the Eastern religion, but in the Orthodox tradition, energy is an extremely essential part of their belief structure, and essentially they believe God is unbounded energy, and that as humans, we are kind of this closed circuit, and our whole point and purpose of life is to open to the larger source of energy, which is God.
Yeah, I think this whole thing weaves into modern medicine also. I mean, the thin line, I used to teach at a 2-year college, and the nursing curriculum actually used to teach an energy field kind of healing. And this, I mean, they taught it, and it was, people paid to have you know one touch, but he referred several times of the way he just had hands that could touch. Any of us who've had things done to us medically, they're just the people were gifted with the way they touch you. Like I just had oral surgery, and the guy had good hands. Other people would clunked in your mouth, go, what is this? The whole machine just what? But the whole notion of touch, and then the placebo effect, right? And your faith.
Yeah.
So there's and then they actually specifically said, well, he touches better than anybody else, and his treatments were not torturous. I'm paraphrasing, but
not unpleasant.
Yeah. Not so. You think of all the other horrible things people did. They cut and they and they basically killed you to fix you. And so I just found the complexity of it extremely interesting, because I don't see it that far from us. Even though we have medicine, there are studies, right, with the placebo effect of somebody, one control group's taking the medicine and the other's not, but they get love and care and attention and prayed over, and it's just trippy. I love it.
Yeah. It's interesting because and that's the whole re-enchantment thing, is like, are we limiting ourselves to a reality greater than the one we exist in currently? And maybe yes, maybe no. Let's jump. Yep.
I was just going to say, I thought it was interesting that Christopher considered the whole question of the association between herbs and healing to be frivolous. I mean, that's an interesting word, because we look at the placebo effect and we study it. We don't consider that question frivolous. We want to know more about it. Or when there is a miracle cure of some kind, somebody's going to try to figure out what was different this time.
Yeah.
What happened? Okay, so once again, I think I'm left-brained, okay, obviously, right? Because I'm still, okay, yeah, why is that good that you thought it was frivolous? I don't think it is good. I think I like our way.
Yeah.
You know, and at the same time we're trying to figure it out, I accept the fact that there are many things we will never figure out, okay? Just the same way they didn't understand that you had to wash your hands before you operated.
Right.
You know, years ago, and things like that. They didn't understand the relationship between germs and infection and blah, blah, blah. Now we do, so we're better off because of it. So that's why I found the question being frivolous to be, okay.
But, and that's how we're trained in the Western world. I think the question I would ask is, in our pursuit of science and our essential modernizing, what have we dismissed that we shouldn't? Because I mean, if there's anyone here that works in the medical world, you've surely heard of stories of prayer doing things it shouldn't be able to do. Does it do it every time? No. I mean, I can speak of many times people have prayed for me when I was ill and I just got sicker. But there are plenty of examples of people that have been healed in miraculous ways that do not make sense and won't make sense. And so it's that balance of, it's not saying the modern world's nonsense, it's saying maybe the modern world has limited us in specific ways.
We don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like there are people who are on death's door, but they linger on well beyond scientific reasons for them to linger on, because there is this vision in their head that they have to survive to some point. Some child graduating from high school, some child getting married, some grandchild being born, and they survive, and sometimes they wake them up to say, she's here, and they're gone.
Yeah.
And so we don't know why that is.
Or folks that have died immediately after their spouse passed with no kind of health issues. Yeah. So let's jump real quick to 50, because this plays in, and I think it was Faye that mentioned this. At the top of 50, the first full paragraph, the ability to lay hands to ease pain with the laying on of his hands was part of what determined Arseni's first nickname, Rukinets, rooted in ruka for hands. That nickname was actually typical for his part of the world. It was what people from other places called residents of Rukina Quarter. People visiting from far away also called Christopher Rukinets. This nickname, he just says this nickname had no sense, essentially, because outside he began to be called doctor. And then if you skip to that next paragraph, the adolescent Arseni's pudgy, childish hands took on noble contours. His fingers stretched longer. The knuckles became more prominent, and previously invisible tendons tensed under his skin. The movements of his hand grew smooth, his gestures expressive. These were the hands of a musician who had inherited the most astonishing instruments as a gift, the human body. Arseni's hands lost their materiality when they touched a patient's body. It was as if they had flowed. I just think that's kind of playing into this kind of liminality between this world and something more. And also, I don't know, I just found it fascinating, you know, the most astonishing of instruments as a gift, the human body. We can objectify ourselves, especially when you get sick, right? You just see yourself as a snot machine or something that hurts a lot. But the body is so miraculous. It's so beautiful, and it's like that intentionality of thought to bring that to it kind of awakens you back to just how beautiful the body is and how crazy the body is. I always think of like the amount of technology we have and the capabilities of robotics to do simple things is so complex to get them to do that. Things we do unthinkingly, like tie our shoe, that's a very complex set of things going on between the eye and the fingers and that dexterity and then something else. Those things are so simple to us, but when you really stop and think about it, it's a beautiful thing. And I just thought that was a cool description of the hands there.
That's kind of a theme too about the human body. I saw that more than once.
Yeah. And I think Robin, I think said the book is so earthy, right? There's such an earthiness to it, a materiality to it. So let's go back, and then I mentioned this earlier, but on page 15, there's this beautiful part. I've quoted it in your notes, but in that first full paragraph, kind of halfway down, he says his grandfather dissolved into nature even more readily because he spent most of his time in the forest. He began resembling dogs and bears, and plants and stumps. He spoke in a creaky wooden voice. Yeah. Just kind of happenstance, he just throws that in there, right? What do y'all think about? This is another thing I'm really interested in. Is as modern people, we're so disconnected from nature, and there is something. I can't think of the guy who wrote it. There's a book called about nature deficit disorder, and then the Japanese have a. What's that?
I believe that.
Yeah, and the Japanese have something called forest bathing, which I've talked about before probably, and they've done numerous medical studies on this, and people are now, if you go to a doctor in Japan and in Korea, and you have high blood pressure, your high stress levels, depression, they will literally prescribe you to go out in the forest for 15 to 20 minutes. And they haven't determined what causes it. Of course, scientists are studying, well, is it the I guess it's the phenols in the trees that are giving off certain chemicals that other people think, well, we just grew up in the forest and it's more natural for us. But the point being is that there's something inherent to our relationship with the natural world. What do y'all think about that in the context of this book? Or that quote with his grandfather beginning to resemble his surroundings?
Well, I would say that is very real. I have to go up and visit clients at the Citrus County Jail sometimes because that's where the marshals hold the federal inmates. And on the way back, there's a beautiful piece of road that has a hammock in it. And I'll pull off the road 100 yards, get out of my car, and just stand there for 5 minutes. And I would call it bathing between the leaves and the birds. And it's just like kind of gets all the funk of being in a jail and feeling a little helpless over your client's plight. And also I'd like to say I'd like some of that czar stuff, because it was the one where on that page when we were talking about it would help them not be convicted in court. I'll take that herb to court every day now. I can just find some.
Anyone else?
Well, the whole book is so sensory with nature, the snow coming in, the rivers, everything. And they've actually done studies on people that are in urban areas are very depressed because they don't have nature, and the people that have trees seem to be more well-balanced as far as emotions.
The Audubon Society in 2016 came out with a kind of, I think like a 5 or 10 year plan, and one of them was specifically focused on having more urban wildlife and wild areas, and it was for the reason you're mentioning. Nancy?
I think the book, the Nature Deficit Disorder book, is a book that those of us in early childhood have read and reading a lot. And Ralph, I think.
I can't remember it saved my life.
But people kind of in my circle have read it.
Louvre, that's right, Richard Louvre.
Richard Louvre.
Thank you.
That's it, yeah. And, if you look at children's habitats and children's environments, it's trending more and more toward plastics and, non-organic materials and that kind of thing. And I think that we ought to have a look at that. If that is the case, why are we starting so early to divorce children from natural surroundings?
Yeah. When I was in seminary in my 3rd year, I worked on a farm. It was a 60-acre farm, and right next door there was a Waldorf school, which is like Montessori on steroids. And in the middle of winter, I would be working, and this was in New Jersey. I'd be working in the fields, and it would be freezing cold, and there would be snow almost up to my knee, and I'm like, it's so damn cold. And I would look over, and the Waldorf school is right next door, and there was 3 and 4-year-olds just running through the woods. I mean, no parent would let themselves do that in Tampa, right? Let their kids go run off in the middle of the woods in the middle of, like, literally, teens with it snowing. I mean, it was just beautiful. And the kids were healthy and happy, and they were wild. It was pretty cool to see.
I have a 9-month-old, and he will get really agitated, and whether it's like in his pen or anything, and we don't have, we have mostly wood toys, some plastic toys, nothing that lights up, but still just being inside. And whenever he's crying, I grab him and I take him outside, and it's like a light switch. He just starts looking at trees, and then he stops.
Mm-hmm.
So it's real for sure.
Aaron?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to spend a week in Ceia, which is a monastery outside of France, or outside of Paris. And it is literally in the French countryside. And your discussions are in nature. I mean, they have a silent garden that's, several acres of just lakes and woods and trees and paths to walk. And I mean, so nature is very part of that, like, spiritual side of the Ceia experience. And so as I read this, it actually made me think of Ceia and the brothers that are there, because I remember thinking that they resembled nature to me. And so I noted that as I read this. It really put me back into the spiritual side of nature that I experienced in Ceia. It's amazing.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Chuck? No? Nancy? Did someone back there have their hand? Oh, Rich. I'm just throwing out names, seeing what sticks.
I missed last week's class. We were in New York, and one of the best examples I can think of the need for nature in our urban lives is Central Park in New York City. I would hate to think of what the people would be like if that park did not exist.
Yeah, that's a great. And it's wild to, like, when you walk through Central Park, you can forget where you are. Unless you look up.
Surrounded by steel and concrete, it is an oasis of fresh nature.
Yeah, and how prescient, because that was built in the 19th century, right?
I don't know when it was built, but I know that the entire park was actually designed by Olmsted.
Yeah.
I think who designed the Biltmore property as well.
Yeah.
And they literally brought in rocks and trees,
right.
and what looks like nature was actually created.
Yeah, but it's just the thoughtfulness of doing that in that time period when it wasn't. I mean, they would be aghast if they saw what it would look like now around. So we have a little bit time left. I want to point out something, and then I want to just get into a discussion of Ustina. So before we do that, though, turn to 26 and 27. So this is a wild part, and you'll have to pay attention to this. Remember this part, dog-eared or whatever you want, but remember this. So a little bit down, right after it says, "For what you obtained," it says, "At times Arseny saw his own face when he looked inside the stove. It was framed by gray hair that was gathered on the back of his neck. His face was covered with wrinkles. Despite the dissimilarity, the boy understood it was a reflection of himself. Only many years later, and under different circumstances, it was a reflection of someone who is sitting by a fire and sees the face of a light-haired boy and does not want the person who has entered to disturb him. The person entering the room shifts from foot to foot at the threshold, and placing a finger to his lips, whispers to someone over his shoulder that the doctor of Laurus is busy now. He is observing the flame. 'Let her in, Milady,' says the old man, not turning. 'What do you want, O woman? I want to live, O doctor, help me.'" So we're picking up on what's going on here, right? He's looking into a fire, and he's not only seeing the future, but he's seeing himself, right? So that's what I was playing with. Not only is he observing kind of linear time, but he's playing with this idea of right? sitting by a fire as a child and as a man, an older man. Yes.
Is there some similar